Hello, last time we discussed about the different steps involved in recruitment and selection process. In our effort, recruitment means getting potential applicants, attract the applicants to the organizational vacancies. And in the selection process, we start picking who are the best candidates who meet the expectations of the organization and the expectations of the organization in terms of ability to do the job, willingness to perform, and able to adjust with others in the organization and also stay for a reasonable period of time. As we are exploring these dimensions, we started talking about the process of the interview. I think the interview process also is one of the most used as well as abused process in the selection. Let's try to look at some more issues and problems in this lecture. The learning goals are the following. You should have learnt and understood common interview problems, advantages and disadvantages of interviews, then also the other methods like references and the background checks and selection decision, and the aspects of making the job offer, then what do we mean by the contracts of employment, and then how can we evaluate the selection process, and legal aspects of recruitment and selection, as well as some dimensions of selection process, selection practices in some of the Indian organizations. I think that's the basic coverage of what I intend to do today. If we start seeing the common interview problems, as we mentioned last time, the interview process could be a very structured one or an unstructured one, or it could be a mixed one. It could be a stress interview, or it could be a systematic process of exploring the responses of the candidate from one to many, and the varieties what we have seen. In this lecture today, we will start with the kind of problems what we have seen during the interview process. One of the most important things is that interviewers do not seek applicants' information dimension needed for successful job performance. So that means they don't know what is this applicant consists, what is that he has applied for, what is that he has. So they do not have a complete job description or an accurate appraisal of the critical job requirement. So when they start the interview process, it becomes too generic. Then they start asking whether can you work in the night shift, can you travel, do you think you can take some responsibility for money, what is that you like, if you don't give that offer what would you do. So there are many of these things are asked. The candidate starts perceiving that the job involves extensive traveling, handling money, then working in the night shift. So the kind of confusion and it also results in not accepting the job offer, and even if they accept the offer, they are not too sure where do they fit in and how is that the candidate can contribute. So it is extremely important to see and get complete picture of the applicant as well as the required dimensions of the job, so that effective matching could be done through obtaining appropriate information. The other important very common problem which we have seen is interviews may make snap judgments early in the interview. So most of the interviewers form the view of the candidate within about 2 to 3 minutes, and once they form the view, what they do really is to follow up that particular view throughout the remaining period of the interview. So in other words, potentially what is going to happen is that the decisions are going to be made on the basis of the first 2 minutes view. So that means you are not able to go, you are not going to collect more information about the candidate to confirm or do something else. So the most of the interviewers, then they become a closed mind in terms of coming to the view of the once they come to the judgment and they feel that the candidate is fit or otherwise. Then we also see the interviewers have a tendency to be swayed by negative information about the applicant. Negative information about the applicant is that he has quit his previous job and currently the person is jobless. And some of the interviewers view very so seriously that as though the candidate has done a kind of a blunder, or he may be coming from a particular school which may not represent some of the best schools in the area. So once person starts viewing that as a negative information, and then they start forming the opinions about the candidate. So the interviewers need to collect as many information as possible before they start forming the views about the candidate. And interviewers' judgments are often affected by the pressure to favor a candidate or to fill the position. In other words, they already in a hurry to fill the position, so they want to do this as quickly as possible. And another side is that very clearly they are in favor of a particular candidate and both lowers the standards. So that means you start compromising the standards of the interview in terms of its objectivity, in terms of scope, as well as the kind of exploration what you need to do in order to collect the details about the candidate. In the interviewer's judgment, if you see, are often affected by the list of available applicants. So one need to see how many people are there, and then but you don't have to get carried away by just whatever the people are bringing to the table. You have to be more guided by the job and the job requirements. So in other words, one need to be careful with several things. Interviewers must always, and it is always and always, must be prepared. Must be prepared means they have to go through the details about the job, understand all the dimensions of the job and the job requirements, and should also explore who will be the candidate and what are his or her best of the talents. So that is where one need to get prepared to do this kind of an exploration. Another important thing is to put the applicants at ease, or the candidate at ease, because once the candidate is not comfortable, not able to open up, not able to speak, the whole interview process becomes a useless process. That means the purpose of an interview is to help the candidate to be comfortable, speak conveniently about the priorities, the learnings, the achievements, the aspirations and things like that. So unless you put the applicant at ease, you will not be able to gather all the required information. And that is how the interviewers need to make sure that the whole process is comfortable not only for the interviewers but definitely for the applicant. An applicant position is always vulnerable, so you must be empathetic to the conditions where the applicant how he or she would face the interviewers and the kind of vulnerabilities what they have. Another important thing is we need to remain unbiased and open. An unbiased view, that is, if you bring stereotypes to the table, if you think that, or if you have a too simplified view of the individuals and the human beings, you will draw some conclusions very quickly. But then as more and more information comes during the interview process, you need to correct your views, and if you are very strongly biased, it could be about the caste, it could be about the region, it could be about the qualification, like many have a view that those of them who have studied social sciences are not good in mathematics. So such views could always bring some kind of a resistance at the time of interviewing, and the candidates may be pretty good, may be excellent, but the interviewer is going to be blind about such new information. And one need to be pretty open in the sense he is prepared to accept new information, not form the view based on some preconceived ideas and stereotyping. Another important thing is ask result oriented questions. It is extremely important to understand how to ask questions. There are interviewers who ask what is known as the leading questions. For example, the interviewer may ask, do you think profits are necessary to the company? When they ask such questions, it is basically the results in an obvious yes from the candidate, and such leading questions do not help, or getting an yes or no kind of a response from the candidate do not help to analyze, understand the potential of the candidate. So always you must see what kind of questions I need to ask, what dimensions am I measuring or looking into or examining, so that the question and the likely answers are linked. I think that's what we are asking. We are talking about this ask result oriented questions. Another important thing is to use silence selectively. At times the candidate would like to think, would like to recall, then possibly would like to use some paper pencil to define the various steps involved in the problem. I think it is important to use silence selectively to see how the candidate would like to approach the problem, analyze the problem, and whether the candidate is in a position to apply himself or herself. And the last point is extremely important. As we are talking about putting applicants at ease, which people also called as the rapport building, the closing of the interview is also equally important. So one need to close the interview with care and help the interviewee to get a formal correct picture of the expected task, as well as get some positive view of the organization and the likely responsibilities he or she is going to handle in the future. Towards making this whole the interview process as a very standard process, people have suggested use the structured interview. I did mention this in our last discussion as well. The structured interview is based on directly asking questions which are job related. So one need to do the good job analysis, and then you apply a series of job related questions, but with predetermined answers, and you can scale it or you can rank it or you can compare it, so that you can be very consistent across all interviews for a particular job and amongst the set of applicants. So in a structured interview, the idea, the thought is to make sure that you ask a standard set of questions and then try to obtain the answers. But the difficulty comes when the candidates are going to discuss among themselves, talk about what could be the kind of a future question, and learning from each other, particularly learning from those of them who have completed the interview, and then come up with some pseudo kind of an answer. I think that's where the interviewer must be a little sensitive about what happens after the interviews are over. As you complete few interviews, you must change the questioning, the details of asking the getting the information from the candidates must be altered, so that the learning from each other is not resulting in getting some spurious information. So examples of structured interview is the following. In this example you can see that like situational, you are packing things into your car and getting ready for your family vacation. When it hits you that you promised to meet a client this morning, you did not pencil the meeting into your calendar, that is, you did not make a note of it, it slipped your mind until just now, what do? So that means you promised to do something, but now you are off, and you are likely to be off. What will you do? Or with respect to the job knowledge, what is the correct procedure for determining the appropriate oven temperature when running a new batch of steel? This could be another specific job related knowledge. Or in terms of the worker requirements, some periods are extremely busy in our business. What are your feelings about working overtime or staying beyond the normal hours? So that means in a structured interview, you try and probe and ask the similar questions to all the candidates and then try and obtain. I think the standardization of the questioning process has both advantages as well as disadvantages. But certainly an interviewer who starts thinking about what to ask during the interview is a much more damaging to the interview process than one who can think a priori about what questions I am likely to ask and what do I expect from the candidate, and based on the answers, how do I classify the person. If that schema is worked out by the interviewers, I think that's what is supposed to happen. I think that's what the structured interview brings to the table. But advantages one can always list, but as we are recognizing, the interview is an important process. It's a process of asking questions and getting responses from the candidates, and definitely it is useful for determining the applicant whether he has requisite communicative or social skills which may be necessary for the job performance. I think that's the kind of a first thing we can do in the interview thing. Another important thing is we can always get some kind of a supplementary information. There could be a gap in the career, or somebody has done some work but would like to know whether how much this person has done, how much so and so has contributed to the overall success, what is the specific role played by the candidate. So in an interview process you can explore and get some supplementary information what is given in the application as a part of the record. And it is also most useful to understand the candidate's verbal fluency in terms of how he can propose certain ideas, how can he defend some of the ideas, and how he provides the thought and the arguments and the clarity with which one can present. So most of these things can be explored during the interview process. And it is also possible to explore the job knowledge. So that means you are able to provide different situations one is likely to face on the job, and then try and ask for that how is this can be solved, what understanding is required, and whether the person is able to apply the understanding to solve specific issues. So the knowledge and its applications also can be explored, assessed through a good interview process. Another important thing is the most important thing is can be used for the selection among equally qualified applicants. So when people apply with similar quality, similar background, definitely you see who is most acceptable, who is able to, who can, in terms of his attitudes, predispositions, and personality and emotionality wise, who is better. I think such judgments are also possible through an understanding of dialogue and discussion with the candidate. It enables also the interviewer or the supervisor or the co-workers to determine if there is compatibility between the applicant and the employees. So in many organizations what they do is to send the employee send the candidate to different employees in the organization, at least 4 to 5 employees, that is co-workers and the supervisor or the managers, talk to the potential applicant, and then they come to the judgment. And it allows also the applicant to ask questions that may be the most important thing, but reveal some additional information useful for making a decision, or a selection decision of joining the organization or otherwise. So, in other words, the interview provides several of these advantages, and also the process also can be modified as needed to gather the most important information or a critical information for the purpose of selection. That means in the interview process you do ask questions, but if you do not get a proper response, you can explore in different ways and get that required information so that you can come to some judgment. But the disadvantages of an interview, as I said, that it is most used method in terms of the selection decisions, but also there are umpteen number of problems, and the most important criticism about the interview process is subjective. It is subjective evaluations of the potential candidate. So, there could be a lot of errors, the errors of judgment, because you may get carried away by some external dimensions, certain elements, or the appearance of the candidate may make you to come to a conclusion that the individual is also very hardworking. So, such aspects like halo or horn effect, what people call, and the kind of initial impression you get about the candidate may make you to come to a conclusion that the candidate is the best. So, but subjective evaluations have its own implications. And another important thing is the decisions tend to be made within the first few minutes of the interview. So, then what happens is the remainder of the interview time, as I mentioned earlier, is only used to validate or justify the original decision. And so, whatever the candidate says that you would wrongly interpret, or you may not listen to it the way it should be, but you always see that the candidate is trying to cover up or not giving his or her best. So, the decisions once made, it becomes a block for listening, gathering, and getting more information from the candidate. The disadvantages of an interview also, that the interviewers from very stereotypes concerning the characteristics required for success on the job. So, they think that who could be the hardworking persons or who could be the efficient person. They also have a stereotype that those of them who have this qualification only can perform. I think that is much more valid, but somebody coming from this region is unfit. If coming from that class, they will do better. So, this class and region and such considerations makes the whole interview process as most subjective one. And also the research also has shown that disproportionately one can think in terms of the selection between minority and non-minority members. So in other words, it does affect such selection decisions. So that means one need to be more conscious, more clear. As well as when you see some people get more excited about the negative information. So that means you try and see, once there is some negative information either of a personal nature or of a professional nature revealed, then you want to be very, very careful, or you give much more weight to such negative information, but ignoring the overall contribution or success of the candidate. And also there are very few studies, and the studies do not establish very clearly the validity of the selection procedure, but it is acceptable to the large number of managers because that is the most convenient and the best method to be used in any selection decision. But definitely one can question the reliability, the validity of the selection interview process. It is not as robust, as rigorous as the testing procedure. However, if you cannot decide solely on the testing decisions, because the test captures only specific aspects of the the individual, and that too it makes a numerical approximation of the traits, interests or abilities or aptitudes of the candidate. So such numerical approximation may not show an integrated view of the individual. So as we are seeing, the tests are not so reliable, and similarly the interviews are also not so reliable. However, one can be objective, one can be systematic, one can record all the the cons and pros of the decisions with reasons. I think that's the way to explore and make this whole interview process as more reliable. The next important point is the reference and background checks. See, these reference and background checks today getting mandated by several organizations where they handle the confidential data, and also they are responsible for the health of the other people, or the safety costly equipments are to be handled by the applicants. I think these are all the situations where one need to go through, and it is a must for this reference and background checks. It is required for verifying the information. In other words, somebody has said that I have attended this school, I have worked in these companies, I have worked with so and so. I think one need to verify this information, and wherever you see the gap in the information, we need to get into more details. Another is additional background information on an applicant in terms of what are his career histories, how does he as a kind of a person, and particularly when you have to rely upon the candidate for confidentiality and things like that, it is much more important to see whether the individual and what are his family background and the cultural background and things like that. And usually this is done as the kind of a last stage of the interview process, or maybe after the interview process. And when you see these references, it could be from the previous employers, and sometimes the individual is much more comfortable to give the names and details of the employers, but sometimes the candidate may not be very comfortable if they have fought or if they have done something with the past employers. So it's always important to capture who are the previous employers, and then what kind of whether can we ask these questions or not. So one need to explore these dimensions with the candidate, and definitely what are the known public figures, who are the people in your nearby community area, or the neighbors whom the candidate knows, and then get some views from them as well. And certainly the teachers and the university professors who have taught the candidate, and sometimes it is the neighbors and the friends. So get these kind of an information and the background checks from the candidate, and it is important to use this information to see the strengths, the contributions of the employee or the potential employee in previous jobs, in previous assignments, and also maybe in the college, the university, wherever the individual has studied. The value of references, if you see, it is not high, since it is unlikely that anyone would name a referee if they thought something bad would be said. So, but a good dialogue, a good exploration do provide some understanding and some perspectives of the candidate. So one should not neglect that. I think the candidate would give some known person as the referee, as a point of reference, and then more additional information may not come. But if you ask an yes or no kind of a question, yes, probably that all the required information one may not get. But if you are able to have a dialogue with the persons who have agreed to give the reference and reference checks, possibly you may get more ideas and more information about the candidate and his or her background. So usually taken up in terms of the sometimes after a job offer is made, and then you always put a condition that subject to satisfactory references. And it is also to be seen the presence of references is often more significant than the content. So making sure that at least a set of references are available about the candidate who talks something positive, or at least there are no negative remarks. I think that is how the reference checks are deployed. I think the next important point is the selection decision. Selection decision, the most critical of all these steps, and then you start reducing the choices, and now to narrow down the number of candidates. So once you start doing this, so you may start with several candidates, then finally you reduce it to about 5 or 6, and if you have that kind of a comfortable supportive job market, and then you reduce it to 1 or 2 or 3 people, and then you start seeing that who could meet or who could be the best kind of a thing. So the initial offers are made in terms of this narrowing down and also arranging them in terms of who is the best and who is the next best or maybe the next best. So such arrangement comes around a critical analysis of all the details obtained about the candidate, not only during the interview process, not only through the cross references and the obtaining views from the colleagues and seniors of the previous employers and the selection test, but the also the interview process. So the several parts of this information is put to use so that you get a complete, at least a bigger picture of the candidate, and the decision has to be made with respect to the pool of candidates. So now they have passed the test, they have passed the interview, they have gone through the reference checks, and that's the time where one need to discuss in terms of the 4 criteria we set ourselves earlier about the ability to perform the job, the willingness to exert, then adjust with others and stay for a reasonable time. So all these the kind of a criteria need to be compared and discussed across the candidates, and then we will see the immediate the line manager and the HR manager, they play a very significant role in this process. The next important thing is to look at the physical test. The physical test, the objective behind any physical test is to detect the problems or the diseases the candidate has a priori to the joining the organization. So if the individual carries any particular infectious diseases, that must be diagnosed, and then physically fits kind of a certificate or the health certificate must be obtained. And also it assists in demanding whether an applicant is physically fit to perform the work. So that means his general health permits to exert, and so it could be in a manual job, or it could be the pilot's job, or it could be the nursing job. So if you look at any of these jobs, so an important investigation must be done, the physical test must be performed so that it is useful. It is used to determine if there are certain physical capabilities. So if there are something somebody is good at, even that also could be revealed through this physical test. But certainly it protects the employer, from workers' compensation and other claims where they can say this job led to the kind of disease what the individual has or the complication the individual has, so that an unnecessary claim can come on the organization. So that is where you need to understand the kind of injuries or illnesses that were present at the time of the employment or when the employee to be hired. So it is at that particular point gathering all that information would be most useful. The physical test, one need to be very careful in terms of that they are basically job related, and do not create a kind of a discrimination against the physically challenged people or physically affected people, but it is no way connected with the job performance, means you must give due importance and see whether you can provide opportunities for the people having that kind of a handicap. Some physical requirements may exclude certain disabled people. That means when you see specifically into the job situation, right? So then when it is not going to affect performance, I think you must ignore the such physical limitations. Other assessment centers, this is an important thing. May be used in the selection process. For example, you can always ask the candidate to work through a process. Ask him to take an instructor positions, maybe asked to prepare and deliver a lesson plan, and allowing the panel to assess the candidate's instructional abilities. So that means you provide an on-the-job kind of a situation and ask the individual to play and perform that kind of a role, and based on specific performance, it could be asking the candidate to give a seminar or ask him to do a kind of a sample programming or write some piece of work. So these are all the things which could be that where you are creating on the job situation and then trying to make an assessment around that. And also the shortlisted candidates are advised of the steps in the assessment process at the outside. So they are told that you have been shortlisted, but do well kind of a thing. And then what we are going to do is the next important step is to give the job offer. So after the process of selection, interviewing and testing, a job offer is made. So now when you have to make the job offer, what do you do? Ask him to join or her to immediately, or do you provide some time? Things like that. So many companies allow a period of time between carrying out the interviews and making an offer. They tell at the end of the interview that we will let you know, because we need to see other candidates as well. So they complete all the interviews, understand, and then the details are sent to the candidate once they are selected. So at the end of the interview, you would inform the candidates, applicants, that if you are selected, we will let you know within a reasonable period of time, or you may say on or before this date. Then once it is made, so the offer letter is always kind of a sent as an appointment order. So you create a date by which the appointee must report for duty. So that means they have to clear off the previous responsibilities of the job, get the relieving order, and then come and report. Or if they are fresh candidates, they are out of the school, then you make sure that they complete whatever the requirements of the college, university, or the school, and then they will join you. The appointee also must be given reasonable time for reporting. So you cannot ask, come and report today, tomorrow, having you come start working. So it is always important to see and get the clearance from his previous employer, and his resignation must be accepted. So if you don't take care of such things before asking the candidate to work, you may run into some legal issues with the previous employers. Another situation could be that the details given by the candidate that you are so impressed, and once you make that kind of an offer, the candidate may think he has made it too easy or easily to the organization, and so they may also leave the organization or resign from their job also in a quicker fashion. So it is very important to create a process where the candidates do think about the job, the career, the organizational philosophy, and make a conscious decision. If they come easily, they may also go easily. That means they may resign from the organization. I think that is where one need to see how you are going to make job offer. It is always advisable that you take a little time and then say that we would let you know by phone or through otherwise in 2 or 3 days. I think that may be a better thing to do rather than that not knowing the candidate at all or deciding then and there about the acceptability. Yes, sometimes it is advisable asking the candidate to join, but it is extremely important to make sure that your selection process is systematic, complex, and it is not perceived as that somebody has been taken in based on one's whims and fancies. So, sufficient time should be given to the candidates, because once the offer is made, so then the question is that to go through a process of resignation, and then they discuss with other people, so and all such things. So, if you don't provide that kind of a time, if you force the candidate, all possibility that they may not join at all, that means you have to go through a similar process of selection. So, when a person is employed, he or she is contracted to work in return for the remuneration. So, and the terms and conditions under which he or she works will be defined as a kind of a contract for employees. So, the job offer is nothing but a kind of a contract, and the contract is proposed to be signed between the applicant or the potential applicant and the organization. I think that is where understanding the contracts of employment becomes very useful or relevant. So, after the job offer has been made and the candidate accepts the offer, then certain documents need to be executed by the employer and the candidate. So, that means together they have to write it out and sign this contract. So, one of the things could be that the kind of attestation what one has with respect to the degree and the graduation and the educational records. So, but the candidate provides all the details, and it is also authenticated and attested by him or her as a self attested things, or it also could be attested by the others. So, then the contract of employment exists if you see from the moment the two parties reach agreement on the basic terms. So, the parties to the contract being the kind of an employer and the employee. So, then you have to talk about the existence of a contract. It means it gives rise to both explicit and the implicit terms of employment. What will be the title? What is that one gets? So, the kind of things what is going to happen in the organization all must be stated. I think the stated ones becomes explicit, but certain things are also assumed. They are part of the implied terms of employment. Implied terms are that an employer is expected to pay wages, take reasonable care of the employee, provide some welfare measures, indemnify the employee for expenses and liabilities in the course of employment. So, there are many of these things that are taken care of as far as the implied meanings are concerned, but explicitly the employee or the potential candidate joins the employer as an employee. So, when you see these contracts of employment, there are main terms and conditions. So, an employer is required to notify the employee in writing of the main terms and conditions of work. So, typically it would be the name of the employer and the employee, and also the date of starting the employment, which gives us a kind of, one can also write a little bit of preamble, and whether previous employment counts towards the employee's period of continuous employment, or it is given as of today based on all the achievements, all the qualifications, all the experiences taking into consideration. So, the date at which the contract expires, so they can also say this contract is valid for next 3 years, next 4 years, the next 5 years kind of a thing. And also talk about the rate of pay, either as a basic or as a company, all the activities put together. So then you also have to talk about the intervals of pay. So that means, are there any consideration that after some years the salary going to be the enhanced, so we are talking about the incentives and things like that, and the normal hours of work in terms of holidays, sick pay, the pension, and the kind of benefits what the people call it the terminal benefits. So one should also give some of the details of what is possible. Another important thing is the terms of notice, that as an employer or as an employee, what is that you are bound by the terms of notice, particularly with respect to the resignation. Sometimes it is 1 month during the probationary period, or it may be about 3 months, either during the probationary period or after, or it can also stipulate that every year of completion of service 1 month notice to be given, and up to a maximum of 6 months. So that means if you have worked with an employer for more than 6 years, then you are bound to give a 6 months notice. So it is important to talk about the terms of the notice, and also some grievance and disciplinary procedures. So if somebody has a complaint, if someone is not satisfied about the salary, about the duties, about the responsibilities, about the designation, so how can he escalate and how can he discuss with the others in the organization? So that means an understanding of grievance, complaints, and how the complaints can be escalated or discussed within the organization, and also the kind of disciplinary procedures. So the disciplinary procedures, they have to state the act of omission of what is the desirable thing and what is that should not be done, called the omissions and the commissions, as well as how the action would be initiated in terms of the major misconducts and misbehavior, and the authority to frame charges and punish. So if these things should be stated in brief in part of this kind of a contracts of employment. I think if we start seeing, the next important point is the evaluation of the selection program. So the broad test of this effectiveness of the selection process is the quality of the personnel hired. So that means if people are able to join and then able to join and adjust to the organizational jobs, and they are able to perform and give a value addition where others can perceive as important, and able to build a new work culture. I think these are all the things which talks about the effectiveness of the selection process. And also one can also see the effectiveness of the selection process as the organization having very competent as well as committed personnel. So the competence where they are able to do some extraordinary performance, cutting edge performance, and the committed personnel is there are no excuses, there where people work hard to define what is expected and they go after it to make some of those things happen. So the committed personnel carry that no excuse attitude. So it is that they are results driven, and the selection defines that the people who are selected are having a kind of a passion, having a proactive approaches, have a lot of initiatives, and work hard towards achieving the set goals. I think these are all the basic consideration to say whether the selection program has been successful or not. And further, if you see that if properly done will ensure the availability of such employees, that means you are also creating a kind of a pipeline of aligned and focused people in the organization. I think that's possible only through a good and systematic selection program. I think we must also discuss a little bit about the legal aspects of recruitment and selection. I think one can talk substantially around this, but employment practice is regulated by legislation in almost all the countries, and the Indian organizations are in India the similar situations, similar controls we will see from the government side. So during recruitment and selection process, one has to take care of these aspects, like particularly the discrimination. One should avoid discrimination on the basis of sex, color, disability or ethnic issues or the minority issues. So one should always avoid discriminating persons based on their background, but must focus on the performance, the contribution, what is that the one can make. Even within the groups of where we think of reservation, again to make sure that people are not discriminated based on their background of rural or urban or the kind of language they speak, but the more emphasis must be provided towards the deliverables, towards the ability to perform, the willingness what they have, and the kind of attitudes what they bring to the organization. I think to make some brief remarks about the selection process in India. The selection practices in hiring skilled and managerial personnel has been historically very well defined, and most of the organizations practice a step-by-step systematic process. However, in some organizations the number of applicants could be as high as could be 1:100. Such situation demands to see the employment is at a premium, and once the employment is at a premium, it may be at the government sector or in a private company, the normal expectation is to make sure that the whole process is transparent, verifiable, and the judiciary is also very keen to see that the system followed is fair and firm. So that is where one need to see and adopt the well-defined and systematic practices and procedures. And particularly in hiring managerial personnel and executives, one need to use a lot of professionalism. So the professionalism has come, and even in family firms, in Indian organizations, they do hire some experts, consultants to select some best people for the best job, right people for the right job. Point is that if somebody uses own personal biases or prerogatives, look, I am the employer and then I would select, I think such approaches are likely to meet with failures. So it is rather important to focus on what is expected and go by a systematic procedure of selecting some of the best of the talents. So once the realization has come, so then the individuals are difficult to come by, and no effort is too excess to attract them. So this kind of a realization makes sure that you treat people at the time of recruitment in a systematic and a better way, and certainly at the selection level. So that means organizations would get involved in the education process, would explain to them about the technology and the careers available, and such initiatives are taken at the school and college levels to give to give a very clear and useful picture of the organization to the potential candidates. And the selection in India, and particularly look at the services, armed forces, so they do make an attempt to give a good picture of the service conditions, the career opportunities to the potential candidates. So unless you do such things regularly, you will not be able to attract some of the best of the talents. And we are also talking about in selection in India today with the lot of specialized agencies. They are available, and they do make a lot of efforts. So whose services are retained by hiring for either for technical personnel or for a managerial personnel. So organizations are particularly in India, they are investing in so-called the headhunters or the consultants who deal with supplying the talent. So unless the organization invests, helps people to do a good job, then you may not be able to get the right people. So hiring technical and managerial personnel through specialization or the specialized agencies are also very common in Indian organization. I think another big argument about the selection and selection process, both in government in many other organizations, is merit versus merit and not favoritism. So the merit versus reservation and also this favoritism have become a kind of a concern in the selection decisions. How do we maintain objectivity? How do you avoid all this subjective decision making which can affect the selection process? But when employment is at premium, there are some organizations working very systematically where some of the managerial decisions are reduced but make the whole process, particularly whole process of selection is based only on the test and less on any interviews. So such efforts have yielded useful results to the company, but at least in the public view or in the views of the applicants, that the organization is more transparent and they are also accountable. So basically what we have done in this is to examine some of the common interview problems. One can always add more. I have only added some of the illustrative examples. The advantages and disadvantages of the interviews and some of the care one need to exercise, and it is always important to go with preparation and make sure the candidate is at ease, and then you also get all the required information to come to some judgment, and the use of the references and the background checks, and how to come to a good selection decision, and to avoid the subjectivity which can be in any of the interview process. So use more structured interview process, and then making this kind of a job offer, and also define all the details as a part of the contracts of employment, and making sure the evaluation is done periodically and meet all the legal aspects of recruitment and selection, particularly of all the reservations, and not discriminating against any particular group, and maintaining the required diversity. And selection in India, particularly when employment is at a premium, it is always discussed. So about the transparency, about making accountable, so every step need to be systematically planned, and then one need to show how it is delivering the results in terms of selecting some of the best of the candidates. And in our next lecture, we will focus on the concept of performance appraisal, the history of performance appraisal, objectives of performance appraisal, and what is the process of performance appraisal, and various types and issues, and how performance appraisal can be used for the good of the organization.